these 7 men, there's a quality in every one of these men, and that is they had a confrontational nature. Wilberforce was willing to confront slavery and the injustice of it in England. Jackie Robinson was dealing with prejudice and racial reconciliation within baseball. Confrontation should be something that comes natural. It comes, your dad has been a voice of truth in this nation for several decades now. In other words, he's a confrontational voice. It's almost a prophetic type figure. But it's an element of the church that, to be honest with you, pastors are becoming more uncomfortable with. Churches are becoming more uncomfortable with. I use the example of a pastor. I have a lot of stomach issues after serving overseas. And I'll go see a gastrointestinal doctor. He'll ask me about my diet. I remember one time when he looked at me and said, listen, if you're not going to listen to my counsel, if you're not going to heed what I'm saying, then don't come back. He was being very confrontational because my health was weighing in the balance. I think that a lot of times we forget that the church is a place of confrontation. It's like a hospital. Now, we use that terminology, but the reality is kind of like my daughter I was telling you a moment ago. She's a dentist, and she texted her husband one day. She was sitting in one of our services, and she said, I'm under conviction, and it feels so good. Mm-hmm. It's just refreshing.
Absolutely. Where can people, I want people, there's people wanting to know, where can I get my hands on this book?
Well, I need Eric to put a good word in for me if he's still listening, because this is the first time, this is really my first book.
Yeah.
And I've discovered that the platform of getting it out there has been very, very difficult.
Oh, yeah.
And so you can get it. You can go to Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. Most of them are able to order and get the book. Family Christian, sometimes they might be able to get it. I think they've had it in some of the local ones around Jackson.
What about a website?
Website. You can just go to killingthechurch.com.
Okay, killingthechurch.com, killingthechurch.com. So you're saying your basic message is the to that, but you mentioned those men you mentioned, George Washington, that Eric Metaxas talked about last hour, Jackie Robinson, confronting racism, George Washington confronting tyranny, Wilberforce confronting slavery, and you had mentioned, but those guys, there's a difference between confrontation by necessity and conviction, and people who are argumentative, or have a bad, what I'm saying? Always wanting to be right about things. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And there's a huge difference there.
Mm-hmm. Let me say this: the book, one of the things that the book challenges every believer, and I believe every pastor ought to buy the book, and if you don't, let a leader buy it for him, because every one of us need a voice of truth in our life. In other words, we need that brutally honest friend who can speak truth into our life, sometimes even when we don't want to hear it. Give you an example. Jack Canfield wrote a book called The Success Principles. And basically, he's in the business world, speaking to CEOs, people in the business world. And he does a little demonstration that I think is just fantastic. He takes an individual out of the audience. He hangs a sign on him and it says goals, meaning Jack's goals. And then he takes this person, he puts them somewhere within the conference center, out in the audience. Then he says to the audience, I'm going to blindfold myself and I'm going to try to navigate through this room and find my goal. And I want you to do one of two things. You either say on course or off course. So Jack Canfield blindfolds himself. Then he begins to navigate. At the end, when he finally reaches his goal, takes the blindfold off, comes back to the lectern and begins to speak again, he said, what did you hear more? And of course, you hear off course. Everyone says off course. He said, that's right. He said, though the majority of the input was negative, he said, I achieved and I got to my goal. Now, when I read that, I thought to myself, but where are those voices today? Let me give you an example. Don Wildman. Don Wildman has been saying to this nation, to this country, we're off course. And he's been very, very clear about it. There have been prophetic voices, those voices that have said off course. We don't have any problem with those kind of voices in the church, within the Christian community. Well, but what about us individually, personally? Who do we give the right to come into our life and say, listen, I love you, but you have this again, I don't like the way you dress. I don't like the way I don't like your marriage, or they'll attack your parenting skills, or how you handle your finances, or what color. I remember I've heard a preacher in a very prominent church that one day somebody said something to him about the color of socks that he wore. Now, ministers understand what happens. They get a lot of negative input. In over 30-something years of ministry, there have been times people have said things to me, and I've learned something. When people would say something to me, at first I would get angry. Then I would be hurt. But then I would say, Tim, are they right? And a lot of times what happened was it led to change, deep change in the depth of my soul and my personality. And I think that we all need that, not just the pastor, but every believer.
Jeff, this is Ray Pritchard speaking. You can't see me, but I'm smiling right now. I was in the pastorate for 26 years, and I've never seen a book like this before. And I've seen a lot of books, Killing the Church, the Failure to Confront. And I want to pose my question to you this way. You've got a chapter in the book called Confrontation, Can It Work in the Local Church? I could easily imagine some pastors out there listening to this conversation, and they might say, okay, Jeff, look, if I take this seriously and we begin any kind of confrontation, the powers that be inside my church will have my job, and I'll be on the outside looking in. It's too dangerous if we start dealing with truth up front that way. What do you say to somebody who talks that way? Because we certainly, as you point out, live in a non-confrontational era inside the local church.
I think Tom Reiger, I believe is his name, he wrote a book called The Fear Factor. And he said the first thing that a leader has to accept is the fear of loss. And I think that what happens is a pastor has to come to terms with this. Is he prepared to lose some of the membership in order to be honest? Paul said it in Ephesians. He said, speaking, Ephesians 4:15, I believe, he said, speak the truth in love. And I think that we do people an injustice. Now, let me say this, Ray, this is not only an analytical type tool for a pastor. This will walk him through how to preach this to his people, how to develop this character within the church, this attribute within the church, but then also how to flesh it out in small groups, Sunday school settings, and accountability groups. We have what we call LTGs, life transformation groups, where people meet 2 and 3, 4 people together, and one of those is accountability. So,
Say one more word, if you would, Jeff, about the whole question of preaching, because there's some fine line that those of us who preach on a regular basis have to walk. We're told don't use the pulpit to air your personal grievances, and I think that's, that's certainly the right thing. How do you preach in a manner that confronts issues but is not excessively personal? Or how do you do it so that you're not using the pulpit to avoid what would be a difficult personal confrontation?
Right. First of all, if ministers don't do this, we threaten this nation. And let me just put it that way. Let me illustrate. You remember when Joshua was, they had the great defeat over Jericho, and then they went to Ai, and he lost about 30-something men, soldiers, when he was trying to take Ai. He went back and he got on his face and he began to throw dust on himself. He began to cry out. God told him, said, listen, stop the prayer meeting. Get up on your feet. He said, there's sin in the camp. Mm-hmm. And basically we see this process by which he was able to identify Achan. He even says to Achan, give God the glory, do the right thing. And ultimately Achan lost his life. A lot of people died because of the failure of Joshua to confront, only when God forced the issue. Paul said it in Corinthians, I think in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 29, 30, 31, somewhere in there. Paul said this. He said to the church at Corinth, he said, some of you are sick, some of you are dead because you're partaking of the Lord's Supper in an unworthy way, which meant there was sin in the camp. I think that we have a responsibility not only as ministers to the body of believers, but the body of believers between themselves, to address and keep each one of us in check. And it's learning how to develop this confrontational skill, with grace. Paul said in Galatians 6:1, if a man is overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. So pastors, Ray, it's hard to answer that, because I think that for most pastors today, they're living under this modern day view of ministries being successful based on the size of the facility and the number of staff and the number of satellites and how many conversions and denominational reports. We are creating this storm in the church.
Talking to Dr. Jeff Parker. He's in studio with us from Jackson, Mississippi area, and he's written a book that is unique, at least as far as Ray and I are concerned. I haven't seen anything quite like this. And the book is meant to help the Christian community, and the book is called "Killing the Church: The Failure to Confront." What is what's the website again for you?
Well, they can go to just killingthechurch.com.
Killing the Church.
They can also go to our website, ssbaptistchurch.com. It's our website there, and they'll see my blog. They can see how to get the book as well as other materials that may be available. So that's ssbaptistchurch.com.
What are we supposed to confront? By that I mean immorality.
I think it can be anything. Let me give you an example. I use this. This is a good book for a husband and a wife. A lot of times a couple will get married and a man may have an anger problem. Now, let me tell you how he'll handle it. That's the way I am. My grandfather was
that's what he'll say to get it.
Yeah, that's what he'll say. That's what he'll say to his wife first time he blows up.
In other words, what he's saying is, I'm going to be this way. You might as well get used to it.
Yeah. Okay. What he's saying is, my grandfather was that way.
Okay.
My dad's that way, and I'm that way. And let me say this: after about 35 years of ministry, one of the things that bothered me most of all, and you have to remember, a missionary serving, watching churches be birthed in Africa, a remnant in England, here in the inner city of Jackson, even now, pastoring a church with multiple ministries to homeless and all of that. My problem was, as a minister, was the lack of change in people. If you think about it, a lot of times people will continue to excuse certain personality quirks. A man will excuse his temper. Let me give you an example. The word holy in the Greek is the word hagios. It means set apart. The word for sanctification is hagiosmos, which is in essence the process by which God is conforming us into the image of his Son. In other words, our goal, just like Jack Canfield talks about in Success Principles, our goal as a believer, and Ray, maybe this goes back to the preacher, to the minister, our goal is to see our people being conformed into the image of Christ. It's hagiosmos. That cannot be done without confrontational voices of truth that are allowed to speak into our life when we're off course.
Jeff, one of the most significant things you've said, amid many significant things, is the point you're making that if the preacher is going to do this kind of confrontation, he'd better be willing to be on the receiving end himself. I think we've all heard about and maybe even known some pastors who felt free to do a lot of confronting, but if you had anything to say to them, they got angry, hostile, and hyper defensive. And I think you're saying, let the pastor look in the mirror first and be willing to receive what